I'm just going to be very quick. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome we have a very special treat today. We have Dr. Veena Singla, who is going to lead a very hands-on sort of applied policy translation workshop. And, you know, I remember last year at the P30 retreat, we did a little survey about sort of what center members wanted. And one of the things they said was they wanted more policy training, policy translation training. So, you know, hopefully this is helping to fill that gap. So Veena is now an adjunct assistant professor here in our department at Millman SPH. And she's also the associate director for the Agents of Change and Environmental Justice program, where she's really leading policies translation training for our fellows. She's uniquely worked in many positions that span both academia and the NGO sector, and her research investigates toxic chemicals and pollution related to systems of material use, production, and how disposal threaten health of impacted communities, especially those experiencing environmental injustice. And I think she'll probably give a lot more examples of her research. She also serves on the U.S. EPA agencies, U.S. EPA's Children Health Protection Advisory Committee and the National Toxicology Program Board of Scientific Counselors. So we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you, Ami. I'm just delighted to be here with you all. So this picture I took from the top of a hiking trail in the Bay Area where I live. And I chose this picture because I feel like when you're kind of up high, you can look around and see the lay of the land and figure out where you want to go. And that's kind of the idea for today, is to take a step back and think about what's the impact that you want your science to have in the world, especially in relationship to policy, and then what's the path you can take for yourself to make that happen. So as Ami mentioned, I've spent many years between NGOs and academia doing science policy work in environmental health and justice. I'm really pleased to be here at Columbia now and part of the leadership team for Agents of Change and Environmental Justice, even though I'm physically located in San Francisco, California. So here I am on a nice boat trip around the Bay. And I want to acknowledge both Dr. Laraya Edwards and Dr. Max Ong, who have co-developed the concept of the policy roadmap that I'll be presenting on today, and that we're working on with our fellows, as Ami mentioned. It's been super fun. And I feel like Laraya could give this workshop too, so feel free to jump in. All right, so the agenda for today, I'll spend the first half of the time giving some background on science and policy and just describing a framework for developing a policy roadmap and kind of illustrating that with some examples from my own work on the toxic solvent methylene chloride. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the different roles that scientists can have in policy, so you can think about what might be appropriate for your own work and interests. And we'll have about half an hour or so for you all to start working on your own policy roadmap. And then time at the end, we can kind of share and discuss. Okay, so why even think about integrating policy into your work? Well, as scientists who care about public health, I think we all have an interest in seeing the most current scientific principles and data being provided to decision makers and being used to inform evidence-based decisions to protect the public's health. This is also a way that you can build your own science communication skills. You know, I think sometimes something we hear quite a bit in academia is let the science speak for itself. But I can tell you, having worked in the policy world, that not a lot of people speak science, and we're really needed as the translators for policy. And this can be a way to increase the impact and visibility of your own science as well. So before jumping into the roadmap, I want to talk a little bit about science and policy and that intersection. So, science, we're really trying to describe the way the world works as objectively as possible. And we can use science and data to make predictions about the future, like if a new warehouse is built, in that community, the air pollution is going to increase in that neighborhood. But science doesn't necessarily say if that should be done or should be allowed. A policy, on the other hand, is specifically a set of rules and guidelines governing conduct that are based on underlying values frameworks. So a lot of the values frameworks that I engage with in my own work are like public health, biomedical ethics, human rights, and environmental justice. So engaging at this science policy intersection often involves science curation, interpretation, and translation. So curation, that means there's very often a lot of science and data on a particular topic, whether it's a particular exposure, chemical of concern, but being able to really narrow that down to the information that's relevant to the policymaker and the decision they have to make is really valuable to kind of cull through all of that and provide the most relevant information. Then there's the interpretation piece. So what do the data say about the policy questions that might be at hand? And translation is putting the science in terms of the policy decision to be made, as well as in terms that a non-scientist can understand, kind of both of those pieces. So here's an example. Under the Toxic Substances Control Act, the legal standard is that chemicals must not present an unreasonable risk to remain on the market. So if I'm talking to a decision maker about a chemical being evaluated under the Toxic Substances Control Act, I need to explain why the data indicate that a chemical does present an unreasonable risk or does not present an unreasonable risk, and in terms that they can understand. So that kind of interpretation and translation piece. And then thinking about the implications based on value frameworks. So like the example I gave earlier, right? Data might say that a new warehouse is going to increase air pollution in a particular neighborhood that already has poor air quality. So drawing on public health, human rights, environmental justice principles, you can say that is not an acceptable outcome for an already overburdened community to have additional air pollution added to their health risks. So thinking about policy, I like to think about it broadly. It's governmental policy, certainly, whether you're talking about local, state, federal, or international, but it also encompasses other types of policies. So like industry standards and certifications, also corporate policies, all of these different types of policies can benefit from better scientific information and data and in terms of the decisions that they're making. And any kind of range of these policies might be relevant to your own scientific work. Okay, so this framework that I'll present is flexible, and it allows you to develop a policy roadmap for kind of different scopes of your work. It might be, a whole project or just one piece of a project, one topic of your research. So you can apply it in different ways to your work. And it has 5 parts. So there's going to be the background and problem statement, the policy intersections, the landscape analysis, the goals, and the policy relevant activities. So I'll talk more about each one of these pieces, but I'd say overall, it's helpful to think about a realistic scope for what you want to do based on the available time and funding that you have. I think it's fabulous if you do have dedicated time or funding to do this type of work. Oftentimes we might not, but you can think about using using this to fulfill like a broader impacts kind of requirement or other societal benefit requirements for grants. And thinking about a timeline of maybe 1 to 3 years, I think is a good place to start. And this does not need to be super long or detailed. I think you can lay out your plan in just a few pages and have a really good starting place. Okay, so the policy intersections, this is where once you've identified the kind of issue area problem statement, to take a look and identify what are the policies that intersect with that issue area. So for air pollution, it might be the Clean Air Act, for example. Then the landscape analysis is where you want to identify who's making those policy decisions, who's influencing those policy decisions, and who's impacted by those policy decisions. So really laying out those different pieces of who are the decision makers, how are they making their decisions, and who's impacted. And very often your landscape analysis is going to include government or government agencies if you're focused on governmental policy, NGOs and nonprofits who are often engaged in advocating around specific policy decisions, industry who is very engaged in advocating around specific policy decisions, and impacted communities as well. So generally you might have like those 4 kinds of pieces of your landscape analysis. Okay, so I'll give an example of those first 3 parts of the roadmap, starting with the problem statement. So this is from my work on methylene chloride. It's a solvent that's used in a variety of products, including paint strippers, and it's acutely toxic and has killed people using it at home and on the job. So CDC found a series of fatalities in about a 10-year period starting in the year 2000 of workers refinishing bathtubs. So there was, I don't know, the formatting on this got a little bit strange, so sorry about that, but it says 13 fatalities is what they found in their review. This was an occupational fatality documented in 2011 in California. A worker was at a paint facility using methylene chloride in an industrial tank to clean it out, and he passed away, and the flowers there are placed as a memorial to him. In this 2015 investigation from the Center for Public Integrity, they documented, that says 56 consumer and occupational fatalities. And in 2017, this fatality, his name is Joshua Atkins. He was using methylene chloride to refinish his bike. He opened a window, but he closed the door of the room he was in to protect the family dog, and his mother found him passed away. So how can we prevent further fatalities from methylene chloride? So taking a look at the policy intersections, there's kind of 3 different federal laws and agencies that have regulations or evaluations relevant to methylene chloride. So the Environmental Protection Agency under the Toxic Substances Control Act can regulate industrial, commercial, and consumer product chemicals, including methylene chloride. Under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA covers certain workers, and they do have an occupational standard for methylene chloride that includes a permissible exposure limit and other requirements. And then the Consumer Product Safety Commission under the Federal Hazardous Substances Act has also taken some action related to labeling of methylene chloride products. But of these 3, only EPA under TSCA has the authority to prohibit methylene chloride in products or on the job uses. So that's where I ultimately ended up focusing. So for the landscape analysis, in addition to those federal agencies, there was some state agencies who were also taking action on methylene chloride, the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. A number of NGOs were also engaged. So the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, environmental public interest groups like NRDC and Earth Justice that brought litigation on behalf of LCLAA against the EPA to act on methylene chloride risks to workers. There we go. Okay. So industry involvement includes the American Chemistry Council, who some of us may be familiar with, who represents the business interests of chemical manufacturers, and then also retailers like the Home Depot, who had actually taken action on some methylene chloride products, removing them from their store shelves ahead of regulation due to pressure from NGO campaigns. And then also the families of people who had been killed by methylene chloride were very powerful advocates in this discussion as well for regulations and limits on methylene chloride. So those pictures show Joshua Atkins, Drew Wynn, and Kevin Hartley. Okay, so for going back now to our framework, we talked about the problem statement, policy intersections, and landscape analysis. For the goals, you can think about, again, good starting place might be over 1 to 3 years. Some goals that you want to achieve for integrating policy relevance in your work. And then the policy relevant activities is a kind of work plan or plan over your time period that you want to complete to try to meet your goals. So what this looked like for my work, so this is the goals and implementation that was about over 3 years. My goals were to conduct collaborative research and analysis to support better evidence-based decisions on methylene chloride that would prevent fatalities, publish that research, communicate and translate that information for the public and policymakers. So the research we completed was published, and then we had a communications plan to reach out to press, really get attention to our finding was that not only are workers the primary fatalities from methylene chloride, but we found a pattern of increasing deaths over the time period that we studied. And then providing this information to EPA as it was evaluating methylene chloride for its risk assessment under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And here, it's important for us to provide a clear recommendation based on our findings and our data. So what this says is our research on methylene chloride fatalities finds that current policies are inadequate to protect workers, and we recommend elimination of methylene chloride use in commercial settings. So very clearly stating that the current regulations, limits, protections were not enough to prevent fatalities based on our data.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, wait, are we allowed to ask questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. I have a question on the risk evaluation.
Yeah.
And I'm mostly curious about, so I'm assuming EPA or OSHA, sorry, I wasn't quite sure who put out the new risks.
EPA.
Okay, so EPA put out a new risk with like, I'm assuming like RFDs or like time or something that they like updated. And then did you all at your back end like redo those calculations, or were you just like, we don't agree that this et cetera is protected? I don't know, you might be getting there, but I was just really curious on how that particular part happened.
Yes, so it's kind of both of those pieces. So it was providing an analysis and feedback on their draft risk evaluation. So one of the big problems with the draft was that they assumed all workers wore personal protective equipment, and that workers who were covered under the OSHA standard, like that all the employers followed it perfectly, right?
Okay.
So we provide a lot of information that's like, okay, first, not all workers are covered by OSHA, right? It doesn't cover self-employed people. So the picture I showed on one of the previous slides, Drew Wynn, he owned his own coffee shop, right? He's not covered by OSHA. He was using methylene chloride to clean a storage floor and it killed him. He wasn't subject to the OSHA standard. And then OSHA's review of the methylene chloride standard, what they found was that one of the most common employer violations was failure to provide personal protective equipment. So really pointing out this information to EPA and saying you can't make this assumption in the risk evaluation was critical, and then also providing our findings from the research. It was all in that paper. To make that recommendation, because clearly it's like OSHA had that standard in place for 10, 50 more, yeah, like a long time, and people were still dying. Yeah. Okay, so some good news actually on this front. Just recently, earlier this year, EPA finalized the risk evaluation and announced a rule that is prohibiting most uses of methylene chloride in the US. But I will say this only happened after an additional lawsuit, even on top of the one that I mentioned before. So in this lawsuit, a number of environmental justice groups represented by NRDC sued because EPA still failed to adequately consider risks to workers and to overburden communities, both of which they're required to do under the law. So this brings me to another point, which is that the roadmap is very much a living document because policy is evolving and developments are happening. So you want it to be responsive to what's happening in the world, to your partners, to your collaborators. And this paper by Brownell and Roberto lays out this kind of iterative process that they talk about for strategic science with policy impact. I also call it policy relevant science, where you identify the change agents in your landscape, right? So those are the folks who are making the decisions, influencing the decisions, and the impacted communities, and have an ongoing two-way discussion with them so that they can provide you information to guide the work that you're doing, and the data and information you're finding can inform them and their strategy as well. So it's this kind of virtuous cycle where you have this really consistent communication with the change agents in your landscape as a key activity for any policy roadmap. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about some different types of policy relevant activities that you could think about for your own work. So there's policy relevant science, informing the policy process, and more direct engagement. I'll touch on all of these. So with policy relevant science, we already talked a bit about that sort of two-way discussion and conversation with the change agents. I also wanted to mention this paper by Robinson and Sherrard. It's the American Journal of Preventative Medicine, sorry that got cut off, where they talk about a solution-oriented research paradigm that can have more direct relevance to inform policy and develop policy interventions. So a lot of times our research is problem-oriented, where we're trying to measure, describe, understand the causes of environmental harms to our health, right? Which is critical. That's very important. But for policy, we also need information on what works to reduce risks or prevent exposures. That's a lot of times the questions that I get from policymakers, where they say, okay, if we ban flame retardants, toxic flame retardant chemicals from furniture, how much will people's exposure decrease? Like, how much will health risks decrease? What's that gonna get us, right? Because a lot of policy frameworks are set up with this idea of cost benefit analysis, right? Where there's a cost to doing the policy intervention, and people want to know that it's going to have some significant benefit, right? So for the methylene chloride example, a problem-oriented research question might be, what's worker exposure from common uses of methylene chloride? And a solutions-oriented research question might be, what are alternatives to the most common uses of methylene chloride, and are they safer? And for those safer alternatives, how can we support and incentivize expand use instead of methylene chloride? So I think it's a both and for problem and solutions-oriented research questions, because we need both. But I think if you don't have a kind of solutions-oriented component to your work, it can be really powerful to think about, what would that look like? How could I add that in? And in all of this, we should have impacted communities as our partners, communicators, and leaders helping to guide this work. Okay, so the public comment process, I'm going to talk about a bit more. I feel like it's one of the lesser utilized, but potentially really impactful ways to inform policy decisions. So just a little quick background on this process. If we're talking about the federal case, Congress makes laws. This is like, I always think I'm going to date myself, that old Schoolhouse Rock. Yeah, I'm just a bill, I'm only right. Okay, so Congress makes laws, and then that gives authority to agencies under the laws to make rules and regulations. So agencies will propose rules and finalize rules that will enact regulations. So in the example I gave on methylene chloride, right, Congress passed the Toxic Substances Control Act, which gives authority to EPA to evaluate and regulate chemicals. And EPA did a risk evaluation of methylene chloride and then proposed a rule based on that to prohibit certain methylene chloride uses and finalized it. So part of this process is a requirement for the agency to take public comments whenever they propose a new rule or regulation. They must give notice and open a public comment period. And the law also requires that the agency has to respond to all the comments and take into account any relevant matters raised in those comments in its final rule. So if the agency doesn't do this sufficiently, this can be the basis for litigation or a lawsuit to compel them to take that information into account. So I really like this example. In 2016, EPA had proposed to withdraw a requirement that certain industrial animal operations had to provide notification of large animal waste related releases to nearby communities. That was a requirement, and EPA was proposing to withdraw that requirement, very likely under industry pressure, would be my guess. So
was a requirement by who or what?
That's under,
It's like community right to know or something.
it might be, I actually don't remember. This was a this was an earth justice case that I wasn't involved in. So I can check and get back to you under like which regulation or law was that under. So scientists and community partners submitted information about how these notifications were helpful and useful, how the scientists had actually used them in their own research and data analysis. And EPA ignored it and said, like, no, there's nothing relevant here. We're going to withdraw this requirement anyway. So Earth Justice and the scientists community partners litigated and brought it before the court. And what the court found was, this is their language, so you can imagine me in like the black robe and the gavel, saying, commenters in the rulemaking put before EPA a good deal of information, not refuted by EPA, suggesting scenarios where the reports could be quite helpful. So the court rejected EPA's ignoring of that information, and the notification requirement remained in place, giving communities information they needed to protect themselves from these hazards, and also scientists information to continue exploring how these waste releases were impacting the environment and people's health. So the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative has a great wealth of resources on public comments on this page. If you just Google EDGI Public Comments Initiative, it'll come right up. They have information on how do you write a good, impactful public comment, like what kinds of information is useful to include, what's the agency looking for, also information on how to find opportunities relevant to your work, like what public comment periods are open or upcoming. So I definitely recommend checking this out to learn more about public comments. And the work I mentioned earlier on methylene chloride, that was submitted as a public comment to EPA during their risk evaluation process. Okay, so I don't know what happened to the formatting. I'm sorry about that. For advisory committees, councils, panels, these are groups that advise the government. So it could be local, state, or federal agencies like the San Francisco Department of Environment or Cal EPA or US EPA. They can also advise elected leaders like mayors or governors, or the White House, like the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or non-regulatory bodies like the National Academies of Sciences. And generally, members might just be directly appointed or solicited through a nominations process. It's more typical for the agencies. And generally, the makeup of the advisory committee might be academics, NGOs, and sometimes industry, depending. Some of these committees are established in law. So for example, the Toxic Substances Control Act has a requirement to have a scientific advisory committee on chemicals within that law. And sometimes agencies just want to convene an advisory committee on a particular topic or analysis that they're working on. So it might be a kind of one-time project or request or ongoing for a specified term of that committee. And many of these advisory groups hold meetings that are open to the public. So this is a great way to see what kind of work the committees do, how the advisory committees interact with the kind of governmental entity, and also engage yourself. So before I was appointed to the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee, I would attend the meetings for many years and provide public comment, talk to the committee members, talk to the EPA staff. So it's a great way to get engaged on a specific issue as well. It depends. It depends on the committee. So a lot of them are volunteer, which is tough because it does actually take a significant amount of time. Actually, Virginia and I were just talking about this. She's on the Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee as well. And it's not an insignificant commitment. So it's something to think about seriously if you do get asked to join. But for the National Toxicology Program Board of Scientific Counselors, it is paid. So our time is paid for. So it depends on the agency and the committee whether it has funding to pay for the advisory members or not. Okay, so different tasks for the committees. It might be peer review of scientific or technical information, assessments, analysis. It's not reviewing grants. They may have a specific set of questions on a particular topic or analysis. They call these charge questions to the committee, like tell us about pesticides and take-home exposures and recommendations to protect children's health. That's one that the CHPAC had a couple of years ago. They might be providing ongoing advice on a particular topic, like children's health, or a program like the Toxic Substances Control Act. And in these roles, really what the way I think about it is like, I'm a scientist providing scientifically based perspectives and recommendations that are grounded in a set of values like public health or environmental justice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about petitions and litigation and lawsuits. So I think oftentimes lawsuits brings up a negative connotation of lawyers just kind of suing for money and gain, but public interest litigation is very different. It's not about getting money or monetary rewards. It's holding government agencies and other entities accountable to the law and enforcing the law as they're supposed to. That says accountable to the law. So here's an example from California where the South Coast Air Quality Management District had made a rule requiring mandatory emissions reductions from certain warehouse sources. And the California Trucking Association sued to overturn that requirement. They did not want to reduce their emissions from warehouses. So some environmental justice community groups represented by NRDC intervened in this case to support and uphold the rule and why it was critical for communities' health that these mandatory emission reductions requirements remain in place. And the court agreed and upheld the rule. So roles that you can play in petitions and litigation, you can help provide expert declarations to support various legal actions. You can also just advise attorneys on the science and data available. And there's also rulemaking petitions to change regulations and standards. So under different laws, citizens can bring petitions for action that are outside of the normal rulemaking process. So for example, under the Toxic Substances Control Act, there's a that allows citizens to submit a petition saying this chemical should be reevaluated, these regulations or limits need to be changed because XYZ. So there, scientists can help to develop the science that supports that request, can help draft sections of the petition or supporting statements, testify at public hearings, submit supportive written comments. And in this example is an expert declaration that I submitted in support of a petition under the Toxic Substances Control Act on the flame retardant hexabrommocyclododecane, HBCD. Okay, so finally, you can think about influencing legislation or bills. And this is something that should be done very intentionally and thoughtfully and in coordination with the right government affairs staff here at the university or your organization, because it's considered lobbying under tax code and there's financial implications. So you always want to make sure to have all the correct processes in place if you're going to try to advocate on state or federal legislation, or at the city level, a lot of times it's called ordinances. So you can testify at hearings, you can participate in legislative briefings, you can write support or opposition letters, you can sign on to those letters. And here's a nice example from Dr. Zoda testifying in Washington State in support of a toxic-free cosmetics law.
Can you clarify, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can you clarify the difference between being lobbying for something formally versus testifying? I am asking that question because, for instance, when we review scientific grants for the NIH, and you are a member of a study section or even just a reviewer for one single time, you are always asked if you need to say that you are not a lobbyist. And that's a question that is being asked. So how would something like this put you in, in trouble, so that you cannot review grants that in a panel or something like that?
And even here, I would say I provided informational testimony. I wasn't actually, the language was not supporting the bill. I was
Okay.
providing, so because I think
Scientific
that
evidence.
I provide a scientific evidence to support health protective measures. But like when I do informational testimonies, I actually don't include language that says I support X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I think that's a very important distinction for
Yeah.
us as scientists, because it could, I mean, we do all the time contribute to panels and evaluate the scientific evidence, but the lobby kind of label could be tricky.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things, like, yes, definitely, you can provide information only and no recommendations on what should be done, right? Like support or oppose a particular bill. You can also work with government affairs to provide a recommendation, and generally, when they talk about are you a lobbyist, there's a federal definition and a state definition of if you're officially considered a lobbyist, and it's based on the number of hours that you spend lobbying. So generally just like testifying for one bill, like you're not going to be considered an official lobbyist, because when I was at UCSF, the university had its own priorities of state and federal bills that it was supporting, and we as scientists at the university could work with government affairs to help in that advocacy that the university was doing. That was during the previous administration, when there was a lot of legislation that was concerning for science. So I felt that it was important to actually engage in that capacity at that time. Okay, so thank you very much. And we can have a little bit of questions and discussion before going into making your own policy roadmap.
I have a question, maybe just to help start it off. I thought I like the methylene chloride example, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why that was chosen, and for you, not as an example, but why, like what organization were you at? How was that chosen as a policy priority? And also then, what other expertise were you able to lean on sort of to do that work?
Yes, so I'd say it was chosen somewhat opportunistically, in the sense that it was a chemical that EPA had under evaluation under the Toxic Substances Control Act, both prior to 2016, before TSCA was updated and revised, and after 2016, it was on its evaluation list. So it was seen as a way to sort of set the precedent for how EPA should be doing these risk evaluations. So it was about methylene chloride, but it was also a little bit bigger than that in terms of being more generally about EPA's risk assessment procedures and practices. Like, do you assume all workers always wear the proper personal protective equipment? That kind of thing. So so it was that intersection of it's both a very harmful chemical that's hurting people, and it's an opportunity to get action on that specific chemical and set a kind of better framework for how EPA is going to be doing these risk assessments under the new TSCA. And that for that work in that paper, I brought in a bunch of collaborators. That was really important because I'm not an occupational medicine specialist. I didn't have the capacity to actually do all the research documenting the fatalities myself. So I actually worked with an amazing medical student at UCSF, Annie Wong, who ended up becoming an Agents of Change Fellow as well to do that primary research. And we brought in collaborators from the UCSF Occupational Medicine Department, as well as collaborators at OSHA, which was very helpful because they could provide information from OSHA, and one of the OSHA scientists was a pathologist. So she did an analysis of the fatalities that had autopsies available to talk about what did the autopsies show in relation to these fatalities. So yeah, thank you for raising that. It's like having that collaborative team and approach, I think, is very helpful in that policy relevant, impactful science, because you kind of bring in the range of perspectives. Okay, let's see. Let's start on.
Are there any questions online?
Oh, let's see.
I think I'll make sure you can chat.
Oh, no. Okay. So we'll have about half an hour now for y'all to start working on your own policy roadmap. You can start with these first three sections, the kind of background problem statement and considering an appropriate scope for what time and resources you have available, the policy intersections and the landscape analysis. And I have an example here that can pass around. This is just an example of the methane chloride work that I did. So feel free to take one, take a look if that's kind of helpful to see an example of what it looks like. And we'll check back in around 12:20 and feel free to discuss amongst yourselves or ask me questions.
Can I just ask a question
Yeah.
before we? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the risk of policy engagement as scientists, right? And maybe, I don't know if you talked about this before I came in late.
That's a great question, because I would be interested to hear Omni's thoughts on that too.
Yeah.
Because Omni, you pushed back a little bit on the lobbying. I'd love to hear a dialogue between the two of you.
I mean, and the risks I have in mind, as scientists, we have, this, perhaps it's a myth, but this sort of, this penumbra of objectivity, and as soon as we wade into political waters, we start that it washes away. And I'm curious your take on, again, just on risks, and I think that it'd be interesting to hear others.
Yeah, definitely. And for people online, the question was, what are some of the risks as a scientist engaging with policy and kind of going into the policy sphere? So I'd say for myself, it's a little different because my career is in science policy work. So this is what I do for my job. But, for my academic collaborators and what I've seen for other scientists in academia, some of the risks can be you become a target for industry harassment and intimidation. That can certainly happen in terms of trying to attack your credibility as a scientist, and that the policy engagement and communication is not necessarily seen by the academic enterprise as something that's part of your job as a scientist there, as scientists at an institution. So it's not necessarily rewarded or credited when you do that extra work to bring information to policymakers. Ami?
Well, kind of to the point, I mean, I think well, and I mean, I think at different points in your career, you may feel more comfortable engaging in policy in different ways. I mean, I actually don't get involved in endorsing policies because I'm not a policymaker, and so I feel like that's out of my expertise. And I think the other thing that David Michaels told me, who is, I think sort of one of the most effective, I mean, he was the head of OSHA, he's been doing this a long time. Twice, he was the longest standing head of OSHA, actually. And he was in academia before and after, and he also made the point that like the policy can go through a lot of changes. And so you also want to be careful not to, associate your name with the policy because you don't know where that policy is going to go. And I actually had the situation happen with my food and phthalates work that got a lot of press. And we had Senator Feinstein's office call us, and because she was the one who did the policy to get that certain phthalates out of children's toys, and she, had taken up, sort of was interested in being engaged in this issue. And so I mean, we talked to them, of course, but we were also careful to not associate ourselves too closely with them. So I'm more comfortable sort of providing informational testimonies in the service of more health protective measures. And then I leave it up to my collaborators to kind of be more involved in the nuances of policy. I think another kind of way that people may have more comfort in doing some of this work is with groups of scientists. So Veena and I are part of something called Project Tender, which is a coalition of, scientists and many environmental health scientists, many senior environmental health scientists, health professionals and advocates. And so they do a really great job because like the advocacy community kind of helps us identify sort of where are the opportunities to engage. And then, collectively we'll do sign-on letters to support certain measures or certain recommendations that are really carefully crafted. And so I think that's another way where you don't feel like you're out on a limb by yourself and there's like strength in numbers if, 40 people are signing on to a letter. So, I mean, I think those are things, and I think, when you do this work, you have to really choose your language very carefully so that I think it's important to capture the nuance of the science, even when you're talking to non-scientific audiences, because I think that also helps maintain your credibility. So,
Yeah.
Darby, do you have thoughts?
I mean, I think it's tricky. I mean, I'm thinking, and I think the point about, different approaches make sense at different stages of your career. Both the sort of time consideration that you mentioned and, but also, your sort of how vulnerable your reputation is perhaps. But no, I think it's tricky. I mean, I think that again, we have this incredibly privileged faith, and I think the university and you work at NRDC, am I correct? Yeah, that's a slightly different stance, and
Yeah.
but the university does convey this, or I think should convey this, sort of you're a little bit above the fray, and I do think that there are trade-offs in getting involved in the fray, and I don't think it, I think on balance, and my own work, I found it appropriate at points to get involved in the fray, but I've always been, and I think this is what you were saying, just very mindful of not taking on too fully the role of an advocate, and being very attentive to the points where the science is ambiguous, or not trying to distill science to the point where it's sort of a soundbite or a cartoon, because there's always, or almost always, I mean, I guess we can think of examples where there's no ambiguity, but there's almost some voice on it.
I was trying to think of the clear without ambiguity, and I think the secondhand smoke, the smoke-free environments.
Or lead, or I think there, yes.
Or even gun policy,
Yeah.
I don't know, firearms policy, I don't know
Yeah.
that I would feel. But for many, it's so complicated.
I think I just wanted to highlight, I mean, what you said about, kind of that collaboration or partnership with advocates and, like others in the community who are more directly engaged with the policy. I think that's a really key piece, like I mentioned, right? That communication with the change agents, which very often might be advocacy groups or impacted community groups that are much more closely engaged with and following the policy, just sort of having that collaboration and communication so that, you can provide science to support their priorities and in a way that's comfortable for you, at a level that's comfortable for you, and they can do the policy advocacy.
I mean, I think two things I would say. I mean, I was probably unique in that I actually ignored a lot of people's advice and got involved doing policy relevant science and engaging in sort of these conversations since I was a postdoc. And so, I mean, I understood that wasn't the normative track, but I didn't want to wait to have more of a direct impact on solutions. And I think when I was a postdoc, actually at UCSF, the timing just aligned where I was doing research on PBD flame retardants. And then, it was a particularly acute problem in California, and we were producing all this important data. And then there were all these attempts to change the policy landscape. And so I also got like hands-on experience on sort of different ways to be engaged, in different roles. And then we got to see change happen, right? That is like very protective of kids' neurodevelopment, right? So that, that's really exciting to be able to see your work have that impact. And so I think the other thing that, Veena's giving us some frameworks. I mean, I think the reality is this is like a muscle that you have to practice using, and you'll sort of, you can test the waters in ways, and you'll kind of sort of find where your comfort level is, and sort of like different situations might require different roles too. So I don't think it's like a one size fits all either.
Totally, that's why it's like, I think there's that whole range of different activities that you can be involved in. And like the advisory committees, I think is a really great one to consider. That is
Less controversial.
Less controversial, right? It's they're looking for academic scientists to appoint to these committees, and you can provide, great science-based, evidence-based recommendations, into the discussions and questions that they bring to you. But it is a time commitment. It's a time commitment, but I think it's very worthwhile.
I think that's the big challenge with all of this, is that the way we are compensated, it's to not include any of this. So it's time and effort that it's above and beyond of all the things that we have to do. So the way, but I think we have to do it. The way is to be, selective, and with time it's easier. At the beginning, it's not as easy to be selective. And also to think of how can you learn back to help you do better science or better education or better training. So to be selfish in that way, because if it's only generosity towards the out with nothing back to you, it can be very draining. It can feel great. At the end of the day, or over time, you might feel, I'm not sure this is really worth it.
But to add to that, right? Like if the different funding sources also value translation work differently. So philanthropy actually is more likely to give investigators funding that do more sort of applied work.
And
right?
even within the NIH, there are more and more opportunities for translation aims, and within centers and other even grants, normal ones, that we should be considering more and more, so that those activities are better supported.
Oh, I was just gonna say for like the students in the room, I think this is one of those like fun things for, whatever future classes you have, or, because it is a different type of writing, right? Like the public comment stuff, I think is like a great example, because you just don't write arsenic is bad for you. Like, great, thank you for your comment, we do know this, but it's more of like, right? Like, oh, arsenic levels in water, we've like shown, I've been associated, we've shown, like, you sort of like write it in this, like, right, like showing the scientific evidence, and it is the trying to differentiate, right? You're not taking a position of like, oh, we want to pass this bill so we can remove arsenic from all of like, water pipes, right? Because that is like taking the position. It's more like, we know that arsenic and blah, blah, blah research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, how you write it. And I think that's like a lot of the, where we do it so that we don't get in trouble, right? Because it can be seen as the lobbying, but there is a way that does take time to get there. And even for the committees, like, you're there sort of to actually provide advice and scientific evidence. They don't want you just to like sit there and not have an opinion. Like,
Oh, no, no,
they do,
yeah.
they want you to come to
You have to work
consensus.
hard.
Like,
That's
you
what
have
I
to come
feel
to a
sad about.
consensus for them and like reach a decision of like, okay, we are gonna do this or we're not gonna do this. Because otherwise you sort of like probably are not gonna be invited back. And you like didn't even provide your scientific expertise, right? So it's not like, yeah, it's the comfort level, but also which one you feel like you can actually, that matches with personalities. Because I also think that like for people that might not be wanting to be in this more like, right, because some of those committees can get nasty, and and if your personality is like, you know what, I'm not combative, I don't wanna like do this back and forth, like, hey, public comments is a perfect way to like stick to what you wanna provide in this level of policy transition work.
Yeah, and there's, going back to Ami's comment about kind of groups of scientists or coalitions, there's the UCSF program on reproductive health and the environment has a, what are they calling it now? Science response network and something like that, where they share around public comment opportunities and put together comment letters that you can sign on to. So that's like a nice way to kind of get that level of engagement, but not be having to do it on your own. And but back to your comment, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Anna, back to Anna's comment about what you also gain from these experiences. I would say I gained a lot participating in the advisory committees. I learned so much from the other committee members who have like a different expertise, different like disciplinary kind of approaches. I've learned a lot that's helped my own science and communication, and from community partners as well. Like I always learn a lot from them. So I think it can be very valuable to your own science.
I think just listening to the conversation, I think one distinction to draw is the distinction between policy relevant science and advocacy that's deploying science as a tool. And I think that, my take is that the first is like the highest calling of people who work in our field, but the second is, it gets pretty, you can find yourself in hot water pretty quickly.
Do any of the trainees in the room have questions?
So I actually have a question. I just don't want to interrupt the rapid fire. So Jamie says, thanks a lot, Veena, for this interesting and useful presentation. Do you think that this policy roadmap should be funded with research grants, or what other economic resources can help to cover the cost of developing a policy roadmap related to policy relevant research?
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit about this earlier, but people online couldn't hear that. That very often philanthropic funding, like from foundations or individuals, can help to support policy translation work. They're very interested in that and in having scientists engage more. And I think sometimes from some government grants that also have a translational component. I mean, like the P30 centers do, right? Yeah. So there's different avenues you can use to find that support and resources. And to some extent, sometimes partners will get grants as well that can be used to, or have funding that can be used to support some of this work. So way back in the day when I was at NRDC previously, we had funding to do some work. Ami and I collaborated on a meta-analysis of consumer product chemicals and indoor dust. So we were able to provide her funding to support that work. So I think it can come from any of those avenues. All right, people want to work on their own ideas. We'll come back together in maybe like 10-15 minutes.
Matt, is there anything you want to share about the work that you've done, particularly with your community partners around asthma and drug alcohol, and how that's been used kind of for?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in some of that. I've been less involved in the actual policy. I think it's more been about providing science relevant to asthma risk factors, that led to like local law 55 and other things in New York.
Judy Rowe, she was here earlier. She has a really powerful example with the older legislation.
The organophosphates,
Yeah.
I mean, she would be good to hear from her about that, talking about industry targeting, at least targeting with science.
And
Big time.
she gives the lecture to the undergraduate students, and it's really, wow, a powerful lecture, because she talks about, she went to Hawaii, there were all these community involved, communities who were very advocate in the process. But then the governor of Hawaii himself, she had the opportunity to talk to him, and actually that was really quite a critical moment in a way. And then the legislation passed. It's a really powerful presentation. It'd be nice to hear from her in my company.
Yeah, when I was talking to her right before this, I was like, you could give this workshop, because she's done like really great work in this space.
Well, and then had like Dow and other chemical companies really pushed to get the data from the Children's Center at Duke University.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
Or Catherine was here, or no, she left. And that's actually the same issue that I was mentioning earlier, that UCSF was taking a very strong position on, that we did lobby on at that time. Yeah.
Was the science integrity or whatever, yeah.
The name was not what it was about.
Yeah.
A very misleading name.
We'll work on it and then to have a short discussion, or is that?
Yeah. Little less than 10 minutes left, so maybe we can do a little bit of discussion. So with Yoshi and I were just having a side conversation about a National Academy Consensus study committee that came on, so we can say a little bit more about that. I asked you right as you're eating, sorry.
I gotta have more time to chew. Yeah, so I joined, and this is one of those where like people either nominate you or you can also do self-nomination. So it's the cumulative impacts consensus study that's being sponsored by, I actually think EPA is one of the sponsors.
Is it through National Academy?
But it's through National Academy of Engineering, Science, and Medicine. And so, like similar to what Veena was saying, there's like charge questions, and one of them and you can just Google me some cumulative impacts, and everyone in the committee pops up. So there's about I think official standing members, about 10, and they're usually from all over the US. There's a whole vetting process because you have to fill out like conflict of interest forms, like report when you get all of these things, and like for your area of research. And then there's something called, in this one they have community liaisons. the community liaisons again are all over the US, but they're not in the committee. They're just like, if you have specific questions with something, like you can invite them, or you know, they might be like, say you really want to hear from like a specific community. We usually rely on them to like provide a lot of the like in-person like logistics and like participations. And so for this specific committee, the charges are, you know, what's the new science of cumulative impacts to inform EPA decision making? How does it differ from some of these other things like health impacts assessment and environmental impacts assessment? There's quite a few other ones that we're in charge of. All like how do we incorporate specific needs for example, like indigenous people and not and or other vulnerable groups. So there's quite a few. I think there's like 3 to 5 main ones, and then it is a lot. It's a lot of work. So meetings can go from usually like the standing weekly or not weekly or monthly, about 4 hours or every other month. We also have in-person community workshops, and for those, they're over like a 2-day period. And then there's very much to like solicit information and like people's experiences with this charge of cumulative impacts. And in those, there also is virtual webinars, and so those like anybody can go to, and you can sit there all day and you know listen to people who are presenting. So for example, I think one in October, I think the agenda's out, but in there, there's like you'll recognize people, for example, like they might be like, oh, we're gonna nominate, you know, X person that does like wildfire research or whatever, or we really want to hear from someone that's doing more on the risk assessment side or is doing more on the economic side, like all of these different fields. And so then they'll go in there, present, and then have open discussion. And that's also like part of like public participation. Maybe you're like, I don't want to be part of the committee, but I want to know what this committee is doing. So you end up going all the public discussions and like putting your comments. This one is like kind of rather lengthy because it's a 3-year commitment. And so the whole point of this is that by the end of your report, they'll say, these are our recommendations. This is what you need to consider for cumulative impact research or like future cumulative grants. And it will be divided into like a bunch of different sections. I think they did, I don't know if it was a consensus study or just like there's quite a few different things that NIEHS does, but and I know Annie sits on one with like, what is it, ethylene oxide and water or and hers is like, I think, like a state-of-the science on that specific contaminant. But I know they released one recently, and I think quite a lot of the like big EJ data geospatial people who served on it. Yes. And that one was like a report on like how to best integrate environmental justice tools from like a geospatial perspective into the like government policies. And so they just released that report, which I think they did over like a 1 or 2 year period. Yeah. And so yeah, so those are all, and quite a few of us are cited. I was really excited. And by cited, I mean like on the like citations list. So I like saw Ami's work, Ronnie, and like I think Robbie's was on there too. I was like, oh my god, like this is fun. I don't know if they actually read it, but at least they cited it.
Were you nominated?
For
you paid?
No, I'm not paid. I'm not paid. I was nominated, and then they do the vetting process is like you put them virtually. They ask you like, you know, what your work, but like, you know, sort of just like different questions that they have. They also ask like if you would, you know, recommend anybody else. They also ask about like potential partners, because again, there's a lot of things that they try to write for conflict of interest. So for example, if I'm like, oh, I got money from like, you know, mobile, they'll be like, yeah, we're in this committee. They also do a lot, like for example, if you sit on any of the EPA, I think that ended up disqualifying a lot of people for this one, is because they sit on the EPA Science Advisory Board. And so that was like a direct conflict of interest for them. So a lot of those people that would have been probably really great also were like excluded from that. You're not paid, but you are, like if there's travel involved, they do pay for that. So they'll put you up right there, like, oh, convenient meeting in DC, so they pay for the travel part of it. You know, you don't get like a stipend for it, but they'll pay the hotel, transportation.
So like Yoshi, it's considered like national service.
Yeah, it's considered a national service, and it's more right, like this like research policy, very much like it's still supposed to be like a unbiased consensus scientific information, or that has better representation for, particularly in this case, there are charges for like EPA, that it does go through
these consensus and they're very powerful. They're very useful in informing better policies. So I think that you have the opportunity and the time to nominate yourself or someone nominates you for one of these consensus study committees. It's so valuable. It's so valuable in informing better decisions. There's consensus NASEM reports from like 10, 15, 20 years ago that still are useful and valid in policy decisions today. So, and you can nominate yourself. This is what I tell people all the time. You don't have to wait for someone to nominate you. It makes no influence on whether they're going to choose you or not, whether you nominate yourself or someone else nominates you. So if like there's a topic that's relevant to your expertise, there's an opportunity. It's very impactful.
Or if you decide that you don't want to sit on one of these, it's not really your thing to be on these boards. I think some of them are all the NASEM, these are consensus studies. They sometimes do public comments for the charge questions. So when I worked at Harvard Defense Fund, there was a board about new approach methods, which are these methods that are EPA is really trying to push to replace animal methods. There's concerns they may not be very protective of public health in terms of chemical risk assessments. And my colleagues here were like, oh, you sit on this board. I was like, not for me. I don't want you to nominate. Thank you. I'm happy to help provide thoughts on the charge questions that the committee members like Yoshi or Richmond Impacts would consider and think about. So I helped like draft questions to make sure I felt like the committee was considering these right aspects of this, because these studies are very important. They will be used by agencies. They'll be seen as like the go-to on these topics.
Yeah, that's great. You can, even if you're not chosen for the committee, you can still really engage and provide that input.
I know, I just want to do a time check, because it's 12:29, so we
Okay.
should probably.
Thank you all so
conclude.
much.